Ethiopian Airlines plane that crashed shortly after takeoff Sunday morning was a Boeing 737 MAX 8, the same model operated by Lion Air that crashed off Indonesia in October 2018. Federal investigators at Boeing and airlines around the world are all seeking answers to what went wrong. Is there a problem with this particular model? How will it impact Boeing and the global aviation industry? In the first half of the program, I'm joined in the studio by Hannah Wanjie-Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, Harvey Zordin, Senior Fellow of Center for China and Globalization, and via satellite by Lawrence Evans, Senior Captain for B737 Training and Checking from Australia. In the second half of the program, when we come back after break, we'll be joined in the studio by Colin Coleman, CEO of Goldman Sachs Sub-Saharan Africa, to talk about the upcoming South African elections. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here. Hannah, pending investigation, what could be the most likely cause that has triggered this tragedy that killed over 100 people, including 8 Chinese nationals in Ethiopia?
I think it's very hard to say at this point. It is absolute tragedy, 157 people killed. And what's interesting and also extremely sad is that just less than 6 months ago there was also a similar crash of the same type of airline. So there are investigations which have been launched. The American Aviation Authority are helping. A number of aviation authorities are trying to find out exactly what's happening in the Ethiopian government as well.
People are looking for the black box, of course, but what is the immediate response from FAA?
Well, the black box has been found, actually, Henri. And the immediate response at the FAA is that despite the deaths of 346 people in 2 crashes, that there's no data that indicates that the plane should be pulled from the air, even though most of the countries have pulled the plane. So I see this probably as some kind of political interference, or that business comes before the safety of passengers and lives. For many years, the FAA and its companion organization, the National Transportation Safety Board, were the gold standard of investigations and of aviation safety. I don't think we can say that today.
Let me go to Mr. Evans. Captain, are you surprised that China is among the first group of countries that has ordered Boeing 737 MAX 8 to be grounded? The whole fleet of up to 97 as such has been ordered to be suspended and taken out of the service for the moment. Are you surprised?
I am surprised, actually. I feel that the aircraft is a very, very safe aeroplane. There are some areas that need to be addressed. But I think the grounding of the aeroplane globally, the way it has been, and the airspace bannings, is perhaps a little bit premature. However, you know, the regulators have made that decision. We can discuss what possibly could have caused it and what the problems are and the simple fixes. But at this stage, just as an early statement, I feel that we perhaps jumped the gun a little bit.
But what is your immediate concern upon hearing the tragic crash, technically?
The problem is there's a thing called the manoeuvre characteristics augmentation system. That's the only difference between this aeroplane and the other 737s. It's a system that assists if the aircraft gets its nose too high to have it lowered without input by the pilot. I think that the major problem was that the aircrew haven't been explained to in clear terms what it does and how it works. And the system is very, very simple. If the nose is raised a little bit too high, it will automatically start driving the stabiliser at the back to make the nose go down. And if the pilots pull back against it, it's a very strong load and they won't be able to counteract it. If they engage the electric trim on their control column, that will disconnect the augmentation system for 5 seconds, and they'll have control and they can raise the nose again, and in 5 seconds later it'll come back and push the nose back down again. There is another step in the recovery for that sort of a failure, which is included in their training manuals, which says to disconnect the stab org switches for both the electric trims for the autopilot and the manual pilot. If they did that, they would have had full manual trim and the aircraft would have flown normally. So I don't think perhaps that was explained in sufficient detail to the air crews. They were unaware of that problem.
In an emergency case, Mr. Evans, who should we trust? The manual pilot or the autopilot?
Well, even if you were flying it with the autopilot, and the problem would have occurred if the autopilot was in, because it would be talking to the MCAS system, that's the augmentation system. When the pilot's hand flying it and the flaps are up, that's when the system will cut in. As I just said a second or two ago, the pilots always have the ability to disengage the MCAS system by turning off the switches to the electric motors to the stab. So they would then have manual control, so they could have done it. And that step, I think we'll find when the investigation is complete, that step wasn't complete. In other words, disconnecting the electrics from the stabiliser.
Last question for you, Mr. Evans. When do you expect China's C919 jet to compete with Airbus and Boeing on the international market?
Well, the market is driven by the airlines requiring aeroplanes, and airlines require passengers. I think the problem that Boeing's going to have now and in the near future for perhaps some time is a loss of confidence by the passengers. How they restore that, that'll be, I'm sure, a big task, and there are a lot of people who would have suggestions on how to do that. I personally feel the aircraft is safe. However, there were steps that were missed, and I think that's a miscommunications between the manufacturer and the pilots who fly them. That can be addressed by training by the airlines. But even if that's done and they find that there's really nothing that needs to be done other than up the training, the biggest problem is going to be the concept that people have that the aircraft's not safe.
Thank you so much, Mr. Evans. The last question, very much, the real last question. Now, do you think Airbus is likely to take advantage of the market shares left over by mistrust for Boeing 737 after the disaster happened that killed 8 Chinese nationals?
I'm sure that the manufacturer would take the opportunity to increase their market share. The thing is, if you ground every 787 MAX, be it an 8 or a 9, the lead time to get a new aircraft, be it a new MAX or a new Airbus, is quite considerable. So if you said an airline, say they had 8 of those airplanes and that's all they had, and they're going to ground a lot of them, they could be out of passenger covering aircraft for a long time. A fallback could be to go back to the old NG series, in other words, the 737-300 to 900, and use that, but not the MAX. So that might be a fallback position for them. But I'm sure that Airbus will look at this as an opportunity to increase their market share.
Thank you so much. Harvey, Boeing and Airbus dominate the market in China, accounting for a combined 92.5% of aircraft in service. Boeing stands at 47.2% and Airbus at 45.3%. The latest figures show. So what do you make of the slight gap, the small gap between the two major manufacturers?
Well, I think they're both competing very hard. And that's why I think...
But don't forget that we are talking about this issue in the context of a possible summit meeting between President Xi Jinping and his American counterpart at the defining moment of the trade war.
Well, it would be interesting if this were to come up, and it might, because President Trump is all about making deals and securing business for American companies. And that's what I think is really driving the decision to continue the 737 MAX, because the President would like to continue to have those Boeings be sold. It's a multi-billion-dollar market. So I'm sure if the issue comes up between the two presidents, that President Trump will raise it and say, it's safe, please continue with it. I'm not sure that I would fly in it, but I'm sure that's the position that President Trump will take, who, by the way, just recently tweeted that he doesn't think we need Albert Einsteins to pilot planes. We don't need computers. We just need good pilots. So he actually would like to take technology a step backwards. It seems like a different position than what China would take.
Hannah, as an African, do you trust Boeing 737 following the tragedy? Do you think the safety can be compromised?
Well, I think we have to wait and see as to what is the real cause of this crash in particular. We have to remember that Ethiopian is the largest African carrier. It serves 58 destinations across the continent, over 100 destinations across the world, and it has been very successful so far and has had a very safe record so far. Actually, I've been on that particular journey myself numerous times. A couple of my colleagues, I know, and actually a couple of my colleagues from the Made in Africa initiative were going to be taking that flight itself and narrowly missed doing so for various reasons. So, you know, it's a very sad moment for us, but also air freight is very important in the African continent, especially since there's so little infrastructure that links countries together. So the role that Ethiopian Airlines plays across the continent and in linking the African continent to the rest of the world is very, very important and useful. So I hope that Ethiopian Airlines will still be able to recover itself, not only Boeing, not only an American company, also Ethiopian, we hope will also recover from this tragedy.
A young man who's been working for the China Aviation Group was killed in a plane crash. He was working in Sudan, and that reminds me of the business presence of the larger Chinese business community in Africa. Do you think these Chinese nationals have legitimate reasons to be afraid? And do you think the Americans, particularly FAA and the Professional Association of Pilots, should give us an answer? Obviously, 737 MAX 8 has been grounded in China, and this decision enjoys a wholehearted, unanimous support from the Chinese.
Look, this has little to do with Ethiopian Airlines. They followed all the rules. They did what they were instructed to do. This is just all about Boeing and all about the FAA. If you contrast the Trump administration policy of, you know, let it fly because there's not enough data, the 346 people who died in the two crashes is not enough evidence. If you follow them, okay. But if you contrast it with what the Obama administration FAA did when my favorite airplane, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, was having burning battery problems, there were no deaths in that. It was immediately grounded, no questions asked by FAA.
That took place in 2013 in Japan.
Right,
Battery-related malfunction was found.
And so what happened was, instead of waiting for a crash in that case, they saw that it was a potentially difficult, dangerous, lethal situation, and they stopped the plane until the problem could be solved. I have complete confidence in that plane. It's my favorite. I fly it all the time. But I would never get on this 737 MAX because I think two crashes under similar circumstances says that there could be a huge problem, whether it's a training problem like Captain Evans said or some other problem. We have to find out what's wrong so not any more people will be killed in this kind of a tragedy.
Given the history of French colonialism in Africa and the natural affections as a result, do you believe more Africans and African airliners are likely to opt for Airbus instead of Boeing, particularly after Boeing 737 MAX 8 experienced such a tragedy, and there's a sharp decline in the stock market?
Well, even Ethiopian Airlines uses both Boeing and Airbus, so it isn't just dependent on one of these types of planes. So it's also worth noting that, and actually for a lot of the airlines, what they tend to do, especially the African airlines, they will lease different models. So we may see that the leasing companies will actually start to promote Airbus perhaps more than Boeing. It's not very clear, or other models of Boeing rather than this one.
Let's come back to examine the aviation market in China and our capability to produce our own homegrown jets. C919 aircraft manufacturer Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, or COMAC, said that a further 3 prototypes of the aircraft will have their debut flights this year, and preparations for mass production of the nation's first homegrown narrow-body passenger plane will also be accelerated. The issue is,
Well,
what do you think of the capability and image of the Chinese aviation industry, particularly our ability to do that, to get the job done and to live up to the expectations of the flying public in China?
You're at the beginning of the curve in this kind of passenger aviation. This aircraft, the 919, is 6 years behind schedule, and so the guts of it, the design of it, is passé in some ways. It's a kind of semi-dinosaur. But that being said, China business people, China design learns very, very quickly. So I suspect in the middle and long term, there's a very bright future. But I think we're still at the beginning of the learning curve, and I think the 919 is just a maiden effort.
Do you think, Hannah, this is an issue of patriotic feelings and sense when it comes to whether leadership of the country should opt for their own homegrown aircrafts? Like Emmanuel Macron should, first of all, use Airbus, President Obama or Donald Trump, Boeing, but President Putin, of course, year or two series.
Well, that is the case in many countries. France doesn't have any Boeing fleets, so it does happen. And of course, airlines themselves do have a lot of national significance, full stop. So even Ethiopia itself feels very proud to have such a large fleet, even if they're made by other countries. So of course, this is in a way a business opportunity for China, but at the same time we have to remember the lives lost at the end of it, and we just have to make sure that we promote safety and risk aversion as much as possible in this industry.
Harvey and Hannah, don't you think China is such an open country, open economy, open market, when Boeing and Airbus account for a total of 92.5% of the aircraft services in China? Thank you for being part of this discussion on the issue of safety. Of course, we are all passengers on board the plane, be it Airbus or Boeing. And thank you, Mr. Evans. When we come back, we'll look at the upcoming South African elections and its economy. Stay with us, please. Welcome to our discussion here. We are joined in the second half of the program by Mr. Colin Coleman, CEO of Goldman Sachs Sub-Saharan Africa, to talk about the upcoming South African elections. Welcome to our dialogue. Who will be the winners?
Well, I think historically the African National Congress, the ruling party, has achieved between 62 and 67% in the last 25 years. So I don't think there's really a debate about whether they will be victorious, but time will tell. It's a question of what the mandate is and the degree of victory that President Ramaphosa enjoys, and with it, what kind of confidence and political capital he has to use to appoint a strong administration to get structural reforms and modernization of the economy going.
Modernization of the economy, and particularly land reform and land redisposal, will be critical issues on the agenda of the ruling ANC. But what do you think are the other issues that are likely to divide the spectrum in the South African Congress?
Well, effectively, the most important single structural problem is the lack of growth in the economy, together with the very high levels of unemployment. We have about 9 million unemployed in South Africa out of a population of 55 million. So the narrow definition is 27% unemployment, one of the highest in the world. That is also still racially skewed towards the African population. So we have a dual problem of how do we drive growth and create jobs in the economy. In the last 25 years, we have tracked around just under 3% growth rates, with a population growth of 1.5%. So we need to get our growth, which is now in the last few years been more like 1.5%, back to the normative 3%. And the critical issue here is developing the institutional capacity of the state, making sure the state administration is strong, taking failing state-owned enterprises and putting them to work for the people of South Africa, and getting bang for our buck from our significant public spending that is taking place. It's about a $400 billion GDP, so the largest in Africa, but and the most sophisticated, but small by comparison to China and the United States.
With the end of apartheid in the mid-1990s, there's no question about the protection of labor rights because it's become a democracy. However, don't you think South Africa has too many trade unions competing for membership, and that threatens to undermine the competitive edge? For example, they try to recruit more members for their unions by increasing or promising to increase the salaries. And then that, of course, would undermine the competition or competitiveness of
Yes.
corporate governance. What do you think of this major concern?
Well, historically, apartheid was built on the back of black labor, as they say, in South Africa, which politicized the workers and the union movement, and they played a very important role, including the president himself, who was Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers. So they have played an important role in the liberation struggle in South Africa. But today there's certainly a problem of rising public sector wages in particular that has eaten away too much of the budget. And as I said earlier, the question is, are we getting sufficient output from the public health and education system in particular? And most of that is about public sector unionized workers. And certain of the state-owned enterprises have effectively employed many people in the Zuma administration era. There are too many people in the state that are underperforming. So Mr. Ramaphosa has to clean up the administration and get the public sector workers to be much more productive and in turn, as you say, competitive. We can learn a lot from the China experience, and I think the Chinese president is very close to President Ramaphosa, and certainly with the BRICS and Belt and Road Initiative making lots of strides to pass on these lessons and to try and sharpen our economic policy.
Twice I have toured South Africa, and I was impressed by the growth of the middle class there. Don't you think domestic spending would constitute increasingly the bulk of the GDP in South Africa? And the next question is, as a banker, what do you think of the monetary policy?
So the consumer and the financial services sectors are the largest sectors in the economy, the financial services, consumer-facing sectors. And this actually is something that's very constructive in the sense that, as you say, the rise of the black middle class on the back of affirmative action policy, greater employment in the public sector, has created a wind at the back in terms of spending. And also, at the level of the poor, the social welfare spending by the state, about 17 million people enjoy social cash flows on a monthly basis, which helps them acquire food and essentials for their lives. And this has fueled the economy, and businesses have done quite well. But we've stalled. That has stalled in the last year or two. We need to get that flywheel turning in order to get growth. On the central bank, the South African Reserve Bank has been seen amongst its international peers amongst the best-in-class central banks, and this is the independence of the central bank has been jealously guarded. Even if the state wants to buy out private ownership of the bank, essentially the fiscal and monetary policy of South Africa is firmly intact.
What do you make of the presence of the Chinese banking services and Huawei in this most developed economy in Africa?
Well, you know, I was personally very involved as the architect of the ICBC investment 10 years ago into Standard Bank, $5.5 billion. And you have many of their competitors, including Bank of China, China Development Bank, and others very active on the ground. So I think you can be satisfied that the Chinese government and the Chinese people and their institutions, including the financial institutions, are very much engaged. It's very good for Africa that we have both bottom-up democracy forming, and it's not perfect by any means. It's a mixed bag of different countries performing in a different way. But the Chinese are building infrastructure, engaged in financial services, including in providing telecommunications services to the countries. And the consumer demographic boom is an extremely strong factor for the next 20 years.
Mr. Coleman, agriculture, mining, and construction the other key economic sectors of the mineral-rich country actually recorded a negative growth in the third and fourth quarters of 2018. Let's look at the issue of foreign direct investment. Law and order are said to be a serious chronic issue that deters foreign investors from coming to a place like Johannesburg, where you have a soaring unemployment rate and increasingly unsafe streets. The same might happen to Cape Town, although the remaining white minority may be the pillar force for shoring up the economic performance of South Africa. One way or another, security concerns about the investment environment might be a major purpose that either serve to, in the case of Cape Town, promote the economic growth, or in the case of Johannesburg, help undermine the dynamics of the economic growth. So what do you think of the security and safety concerns on the side of the investors, particularly Chinese investors who want to invest more in infrastructure and help with industrialization?
So let me assure your viewers that I think while security is always a concern, it may be an overblown factor. South Africa is very attractive for tourists, including Chinese tourists. Second assurance is that the President is very focused on removing obstacles to investment, including for tourist and business purposes, removing visa obstacles. There's been a very clear policy directive. It needs to be followed up in action by making visas much more easy to come by for foreigners, including the Chinese. But I think that you will see with the new administration a renewed sense of vigor about implementing reforms, about dealing with the land issue, about assuring people's safety, and about opening the doors for investment. Certainly from where I sit at Goldman Sachs, we see many large companies renewing the playbook and looking at, is South Africa a place as a platform for Africa that they should be investing? And I think on the back of the elections, there are hopeful signs that if this administration puts in place a strong team, that we will see renewed economic reforms with a view to getting back in the short term, in the next couple of years, to 3% growth rates, and then hopefully to stronger 5% growth rates where we can deal with the unemployment problem.
Mr. Coleman, do you foresee a repeat of what happened in Zimbabwe in terms of land expropriation?
No, I don't. I think that Zimbabwe was a very specific case in point. I think that the President has been very clear, and I'm one of the business people in talking to him that has pointed out the need to give assurance about security of tenure, property rights, that property owned or bought is not like some other emerging markets where you wake up overnight and your property is gone. That it's very clear that you own what you bought, that you're legally protected, and South Africa's constitutional legal system will protect investors.
Thank you, Colin. You fell short of mentioning yet other attractions such as wines and whiskies in South Africa. Beautiful. I promise you.
Thank you for
See you next time. Goodbye.